I have been asked more times than I can count whether I believe in private revelations. And my answer has always been the same. Belief in private revelations is not required by the faith. The Church does not oblige you to accept Fatima or Lourdes or any apparition that has received ecclesiastical approval. What she offers in approving such events is a judgment that the content is worthy of belief, that nothing in the messages contradicts defined doctrine, and that the supernatural character of the events cannot be explained away by purely natural means. That is a limited approval. It is not an infallible declaration. And it is precisely because I understand what that approval means and what it does not mean that I am willing to speak about what I am going to speak about today. Because there is an apparition, largely unknown to most Catholics in the English-speaking world, that I regard with a seriousness I do not extend to many of the phenomena that currently enjoy popular attention. I want to be careful here, and I want to be precise because precision is what the faith demands. And imprecision in matters of this kind has done enormous damage to the spiritual lives of ordinary Catholics who deserved better from the priests and theologians who were supposed to guide them. The apparition I'm referring to is that of Our Lady of Good Success, which took place in Quito, Ecuador, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, to a Spanish Conceptionist nun named Mother Mariana de Jesus Torres. I have studied this apparition carefully. I have examined the theological content of the messages. I have looked at the historical record, at the ecclesiastical approvals it received, at the supernatural phenomena associated with it, including the incorruption of Mother Mariana's body, which was discovered in 1906, and examined by medical professionals who could offer no natural explanation for its preservation. And I will tell you plainly, what Our Lady communicated to this woman in the convent of the Immaculate Conception in Quito is, in my judgment, among the most theologically serious and pastorally urgent Marian messages in the history of the Church. It is not well known. It is not widely promoted. And the reason for that, I will argue, is itself part of what the apparition predicted. To understand why this apparition matters, you have to understand something about the nature of the spiritual combat. I have spent decades in the ministry of exorcism, and I can tell you from direct experience that the enemy does not operate randomly. He operates with strategy. He has a tactical intelligence, inferior to the divine intellect in every way, but sophisticated enough to deceive men who consider themselves educated, sophisticated enough to corrupt institutions from within over long periods of time, sophisticated enough to ensure that the messages most dangerous to his operation receive the least amount of attention. When you understand demonic strategy, you begin to understand why certain truths are suppressed, not necessarily by direct intervention, but by the gradual erosion of the intellectual and spiritual environment in which those truths could be received and transmitted. Our Lady of Good Success speaks directly into that erosion. She names it. She describes it with a specificity that, when you read it in light of what the 20th century actually produced in the life of the Church, is not merely impressive. It is difficult to explain without reference to genuine prophetic knowledge. Mother Mariana de Jesus Torres was born in Spain in 1563 and entered religious life at a young age before traveling to the New World as part of a group of nuns who founded the Conceptionist convent in Quito. She was a woman of serious interior life, formed in the tradition of the great Spanish mystics of the 16th century, a tradition that included Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, a tradition shaped by rigorous Thomistic theology and a profound awareness of both the grandeur of God and the reality of evil. She was not a visionary by temperament in the sense of someone who sought extraordinary experiences. The accounts of her life describe a woman oriented entirely toward God through the ordinary means of the sacraments, the divine office, and the practice of virtue. The apparitions she received were not, in her own account, sought or desired. They came upon her as a weight, as a responsibility, as something she carried with considerable suffering rather than consolation. This is consistent with what the tradition teaches us about genuine mystical experience. The saints do not typically receive visions as rewards. They receive them as missions, and the mission given to Mother Mariana was to receive, preserve, and transmit a message about the future of the Church and the world, a message whose full significance would only become apparent centuries after her death. What Our Lady told her across a series of apparitions spanning several decades touches on matters of the highest theological and spiritual importance. I need you to listen to this message very carefully, because what I'm about to reveal could protect your health and perhaps even save your life. For a long time, I didn't realize the danger that excess blood sugar represented. I discovered that high glucose levels can increase the risk of heart attack, stroke, vision loss, and even amputations. The scariest thing is that type 2 diabetes often acts silently. Many people believe everything is fine when in fact their bodies are already suffering serious damage. And if your blood sugar is high right now, you may be at much greater risk than you imagine. But then I discovered a completely natural method that helped me understand how to balance my blood sugar levels and regain my quality of life. Thousands of people are also discovering this simple method and learning how to naturally reduce excess sugar and avoid the dangers of type 2 diabetes. And there's something important you need to know. All this information is compiled in a special video that we don't know how long will be available. If you want to discover what I discovered and learn a natural way to help control your blood sugar levels, click the link in the first pinned comment now and watch the video before it's taken down. She spoke of a crisis that would overtake the church in the 20th century, a crisis characterized not primarily by external persecution, though that would come as well, but by internal corruption, by the corruption of morals among the clergy, by the abandonment of the sacramental life among the faithful, by the spread of impurity as a normalized condition of human existence, by the loss of the sense of the sacred in the liturgical life of the church. She described a time when the lamp of faith would be nearly extinguished, when confusion would reign in the minds of Catholics about the most fundamental truths of the faith, when the consecrated life would lose its discipline and its fervor, when the sacrament of matrimony would be attacked and dishonored, when children would be formed not in the fear of God, but in the habits of the world. She used language that any honest Catholic reading it today, with knowledge of what the 20th century actually produced, must receive with the gravity it deserves. I want to address directly the objection that some will raise, which is that prophecies of church crisis are common across the history of private revelation, that the 19th and 20th centuries produced a considerable volume of apocalyptic Marian messages, and that the accuracy of such predictions is easy to claim retrospectively. This is a fair methodological concern, and it is one that I take seriously, precisely because I have seen the damage done by credulous Catholics who treat every alleged apparition as equally valid and every alleged prophecy as equally worthy of attention. The difference with Our Lady of Good Success is not merely that the content seems to match subsequent historical events. The difference is that the apparition was approved by legitimate ecclesiastical authority in the early 17th century, that the approval predates by centuries the events it describes, that the theology contained in the messages is entirely consistent with the defined doctrine of the Church and with the best theological tradition, and that the supernatural character of the events, including not only the visions themselves, but the miraculous preservation of Mother Mariana's body and several other phenomena documented at the time, was evaluated and confirmed by church authorities who had every reason to be cautious in their judgments. The approval is real, the theological content is serious, and the historical record is more than sufficient to justify the attention I am giving it here. Let me speak now about the specific theological content, because this is where the apparition becomes not merely interesting, but urgent. Our Lady speaks in the accounts preserved by Mother Mariana and transmitted through the historical documents of the convent about the relationship between the corruption of morals and the loss of the faith. This is not a novel theological observation. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us that the passions, when disordered, obscure the intellect. When a man lives in habitual mortal sin, his capacity to receive and assent to supernatural truth is compromised, not because the truth becomes less available to him from the outside, but because the interior disposition required to receive truth is damaged by the disorder of the will and the passions. This is a fundamental Thomistic principle, and it has direct pastoral implications. When Our Lady warns about the spread of impurity as a characteristic feature of the crisis she is describing, she is not simply making a moral observation about human behavior. She is describing a theological mechanism by which entire populations lose access to the faith, not through argument, not through persecution, but through the progressive incapacitation of the faculties by which the faith is received and transmitted. This is why she connects the attack on purity to the attack on the priesthood and to the corruption of the liturgical life of the Church. These are not separate problems. They are expressions of a single underlying disorder, which is the disorder of the will in its relation to God and to truth. What struck me most in my own study of this apparition was the specificity with which Our Lady speaks about the crisis of the priesthood. She does not speak in vague terms about priests who fail in their duties. She describes a condition in which the very formation of priests is corrupted, in which the virtues necessary for the priestly life are not cultivated in seminaries, in which the men who are ordained are ill-equipped by their formation to resist the pressures that will be brought against them by the world and by the enemy. She speaks of priests who will lack the courage to proclaim the truth, who will accommodate themselves to the spirit of the age, who will fail their people not out of malice, but out of a weakness that was never addressed and never corrected in their formation. Anyone who has spent time in the ministry of priestly formation, or who has observed carefully what happened to seminaries in the decades following the Second Vatican Council, will recognize in this description something that has the weight of lived experience, not of abstract prediction. Our Lady was not describing an imaginary future. She was describing with precise theological categories the mechanism by which the crisis of the priesthood was going to unfold, and it unfolded exactly as she described. There is another element of the messages that I want to address because it is directly relevant to the ministry of deliverance and exorcism that has occupied a significant part of my priestly life. Our Lady speaks about the activity of demonic forces in relation to the crisis she is describing, and she does so with a theological precision that goes well beyond what most Catholics are prepared to think about. She does not suggest that the crisis of the Church is simply the result of human weakness or human malice, though both of those play a role. She identifies a coordinated demonic operation aimed at the destruction of the faith, aimed specifically at the destruction of the three things that the enemy most hates, which are the Eucharist, the priesthood, and the sanctity of marriage. If you have ever sat across from a person in the grip of serious demonic oppression, if you have ever conducted the solemn rite of exorcism of the Church, if you have ever looked into the eyes of someone whose intellect and will have been compromised by long submission to the influence of evil spirits, you know that what the enemy wants is the destruction of precisely those things. He wants to destroy the Eucharist because it is the body and blood of the Lord, the source and summit of the Christian life, the most powerful force of sanctification available to the human person in this life. He wants to destroy the priesthood because without valid priests there are no valid sacraments, and without the sacraments the ordinary means of grace are cut off from the faithful. He wants to destroy marriage because the family is the domestic church, the primary environment in which the faith is transmitted from one generation to the next, and if the family is destroyed, the transmission of the faith is interrupted at its most fundamental level. Our Lady names these three targets explicitly, and when I read that, as a priest who has spent decades in direct combat with the demonic, I recognize in it not the language of pious exhortation, but the language of someone who understands exactly what she is talking about. I want to speak now about why this apparition is not better known, because that question is itself theologically significant. There are apparitions that receive significant popular attention, that become the subjects of best-selling books and widely attended pilgrimages and enthusiastic lay apostolates, and yet which carry comparatively little theological substance, which say very little that could not have been derived from the ordinary teaching of the Church, which do not challenge their hearers in any serious way. And then there are apparitions like Our Lady of Good Success, which are theologically dense, which make specific and uncomfortable demands on the faithful and on the Church, which speak about the crisis of the Church in terms that implicate not only the world, but the clergy and the hierarchy themselves, and which receive comparatively little attention from the mainstream of Catholic popular culture. This disproportion is not accidental. It is not simply a matter of geography or of language, though those factors play a role. It is, in part, a consequence of the very dynamic that the apparition itself describes. If the enemy's strategy involves ensuring that the most dangerous truths receive the least attention, then it is entirely consistent with that strategy that an apparition which names his methods and identifies his targets should remain largely unknown to the very faithful who most need to hear it. Let me speak practically now, because I have always believed that theology divorced from practice is a sterile enterprise, and that the measure of any theological insight is what it produces in the concrete life of the person who receives it. What does Our Lady of Good Success ask of the faithful? She asks for prayer, and she is specific about what kind of prayer she means. She asks for the rosary, and she asks for it not as a devotional supplement to the Christian life, but as a weapon of spiritual combat, as the instrument by which the faithful are to cooperate with her in resisting the demonic operation she has described. She asks for fidelity to the sacramental life, particularly to the Eucharist and to confession, not because fidelity to the sacraments is a novelty, but because in the period of crisis she describes, that fidelity will become a form of resistance, a refusal to be swept away by the tide of confusion and indifference that she knows will engulf the majority. She asks for fidelity to the truth of the faith in its integrity, for a refusal to accommodate the faith to the spirit of the age, for a willingness to suffer the contempt and the marginalization that comes with holding to the fullness of Catholic doctrine in a world and in an ecclesial environment where that fullness is no longer welcome. These are not easy demands. They are not demands that can be met by a merely sentimental attachment to Catholicism. They require the kind of interior formation that the tradition has always called asceticism, the disciplined ordering of the intellect and will and passions toward God, sustained over a lifetime by the grace of the sacraments and the practice of prayer. There is a statue associated with this apparition that deserves particular attention. Our Lady herself, according to the accounts, directed that a statue be made of her under this title, and she described in detail how it should look. The statue depicts her with a solemn and maternal expression, holding a crozier, the symbol of ecclesiastical authority, in her right hand, indicating her role as the one who preserves and protects the Church through the crisis she has described. The statue has a documented history of miraculous phenomena associated with it, and it remains venerated today in the Conceptionist convent in Quito, the same convent in which Mother Mariana lived and died. I mention the statue not as a matter of curiosity, but because it points to something theologically important, which is the relationship between Our Lady and the authority of the Church. She comes bearing a crozier not to supplant the authority of the hierarchy, but to indicate that in the crisis she is describing, her maternal intercession is directed precisely toward the preservation of that authority and the correction of its abuses. She is not an apparition for those who wish to use private revelation as a pretext for rebellion against the Church. She is an apparition that calls the faithful to deeper fidelity to the Church, even in the midst of the Church's crisis, and to deeper confidence in her maternal intercession as the means by which that crisis will ultimately be resolved. I want to close by speaking about what I think is the deepest message of this apparition, the one that underlies everything else Our Lady says to Mother Mariana, and that gives the whole prophecy its spiritual coherence. At the heart of everything she says is a call to trust. Not a naive trust that ignores the reality of the crisis, not a sentimental trust that refuses to look at the evidence of the Church's wounds, but a trust rooted in the theological virtue of faith, in the conviction that God has not abandoned His Church, that the gates of hell will not prevail against it, that the darkness of this present moment, however deep it may seem, is not the last word. Our Lady does not give Mother Mariana a message of despair. She gives her a message that is, in its essence, an act of confidence in the sovereignty of God over the disasters that human weakness and demonic malice have produced. She tells her that there will be a restoration. She tells her that the period of crisis will pass. She tells her that the faithful who persevere, who hold to the fullness of the faith and the integrity of the sacramental life and the discipline of prayer, will see with their own eyes or will transmit to their children and grandchildren the experience of a church renewed. This is not easy consolation. It is hard consolation, the consolation of someone who knows that the night will be long and that the dawn will not come without cost, but who knows with absolute certainty that the dawn will come. If you have never heard of Our Lady of Good Success, I urge you to read about her, not with the credulity that treats every private revelation as infallible and every alleged prophecy as divine command, but with the sober theological judgment that the Church herself models in her careful process of discernment. Read the messages. Examine the theological content against the standard of defined doctrine. Consider the historical record of the apparition's approval and the supernatural phenomena associated with it. And then ask yourself honestly whether what Our Lady said to a Spanish nun in a convent in Quito 4 centuries ago speaks to the moment we are living in. I think you will find, as I have found, that it speaks to it with a precision and a depth that demands not merely academic interest, but a concrete response in the way you live your faith. Pray the Rosary. Go to confession. Receive the Eucharist with the reverence it deserves. Hold to the fullness of Catholic doctrine without apology and without accommodation. Form your children and your households in the fear of God and trust that Our Lady, who came to a convent in the New World to warn and to encourage the faithful who would live through the crisis she foresaw, has not ceased to intercede for those of us who are living that crisis right now. She knew this moment was coming, and she prepared for it. The question is whether we will receive what she prepared. It is hard consolation, the consolation of someone who knows that the night will be long and that the dawn will not come without cost, but who knows with absolute certainty that the dawn will come. If you have never heard of Our Lady of Good Success, I urge you to read about her, not with the credulity that treats every private revelation as infallible and every alleged prophecy as divine command, but with the sober theological judgment that the Church herself models in her careful process of discernment. Read the messages. Examine the theological content against the standard of defined doctrine. Consider the historical record of the apparition's approval and the supernatural phenomena associated with it. And then ask yourself honestly whether what Our Lady said to a Spanish nun in a convent in Quito 4 centuries ago speaks to the moment we are living in. I think you will find, as I have found, that it speaks to it with a precision and a depth that demands not merely academic interest, but a concrete response in the way you live your faith. Pray the rosary. Go to confession. Receive the Eucharist with the reverence it deserves. Hold to the fullness of Catholic doctrine without apology and without accommodation. Form your children and your households in the fear of God. And trust that Our Lady, who came to a convent in the New World to warn and to encourage the faithful who would live through the crisis she foresaw, has not ceased to intercede for those of us who are living that crisis right now. She knew this moment was coming, and she prepared for it. The question is whether we will receive what she prepared.